Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement 2. On today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a video card. Kind of an unusual. I don't normally do a video just specifically on one card, but there's something super cool about this very cheap clone video card that I think makes it worth talking about and me making at least a second channel video about it. The card we're going to be looking at today is an 8-bit ISA video card made by the company VTEC. And yeah, VTEC is the same company that back in the 80s was making Apple II clones and IBM PC clones. It's a Hong Kong company. And then they made a whole line of children's educational computer, learning computer things that they still make all the way up until 2024. Oh, at least I think they do. You can see here on the sticker, it's a monochrome graphics / color graphics card, Video Technology Computers Limited, made in Hong Kong, and there's an FCC ID if you are curious about it. Now, at first blush, when you look at this card, you might think, oh, okay, it's just a normal video card, and it's probably just a CGA and an MDA card. You can see there's a switch right here. You can switch between MDA and CGA output. They both use the same 9-pin connector. And it has 2 video jacks here, and if you look on the PCB, you can see the top one says mono, and this one, I think if we move this little transistor out of the way, it says color. So this is for the CGA video output, and normally you have a color composite output, so you can hook up a regular color television or whatever to your CGA system. That would be just like on the original IBM cards. And then you have a monochrome output where the color burst signal is not included. And that's extra good if you're hooking up to something like a monochrome composite video monitor, because that will make sure that you'll get a nice clear picture without any of the NTSC artifacts that you might have otherwise on the color video output. Now, I actually have a couple of these cards, and the other one is basically identical to this, except it's missing these 2 composite video jacks and some of these components over here, which are obviously part of the video output circuitry for composite video. Otherwise, the other card is exactly the same with the toggle switch, the 9-pin connector, it has the light pen connector right here, and then the rest of the components are all the same. Now, this particular card is the one I always keep around on the bench. In fact, I have a little stash of cards over there that I regularly use for testing, and I like this one just because it gives me the most flexibility with monochrome and CGA video output. And because this has the switch here for switching between the modes, it's even easier to use than a lot of the other clone cards, which you might have seen. They're usually similar sized or maybe a little bit smaller, but they have jumpers on them that you have to set to switch between CGA or MDA modes. Not to mention the composite video output's also handy sometimes if I'm testing out like CRT or whatever, and I want to just test a high resolution 80-column text, well, I can do that very easily with this card. So it's a good all-around card, but this card actually has some secrets to it that make it even more cool and different than what you would expect. So when I first got this card, I just assumed it was just a standard CGA 4-color video card and MDA. Like, it just did nothing more than IBM CGA emulation and MDA. That's it. Well, one day I was looking at the card and I noticed that it had several jumper locations on the board that were unpopulated. And if we flip this over here, you can see I've actually done a little bit of soldering on here, and this bodge wire is one I did not put on there, but that one I did. And you can see where I've actually gone ahead and soldered on some pin headers here for various jumpers, because I wanted to kind of explore what exactly did these jumpers on here do, the ones that weren't populated? Because maybe there was some extra functionality hidden in this card that I could enable with some of these jumpers. Now, when you look over here in this section, you can see the 2 pin headers that I installed. It was this one and this one. This set here, since there's no flux, that was already installed in the board. And the way it works is the middle pin here goes to a resistor right there, and this is what goes into one of those surface mount chips. And setting the jumper either pulls it up to 5 volts or pulls it down to ground. And the way it was wired up originally is I think there was a trace that just went from probably that pin right to the resistor. So on the top side, I cut that trace, and then I connected the resistor to the middle pin so it matches all 3 of these resistors. And now, depending on which position that jumper is in, it either grounds or pulls up to 5 volts the input into the chip, which goes through that resistor right there. So that's why that bodge wire is there. And in fact, take a look right there. You see how you see a little bit of copper right there? And that's because I actually cut that trace that goes from this leg of the resistor R7, which just went to this top pin position. Now, when we take a look at the ICs on here, this is sort of very typical of clone video card construction. These chips here take all of those complicated logic chips and functions that were on the original CGA and MDA card, and they combine it into these little ASICs that VTEC themselves designed and manufactured. Over here, we have most likely what are ROMs, like character ROMs or something like that. And up here, you can see that we have 64 kilobytes of video memory. Now, the thing is that's interesting is that CGA doesn't use 64K of RAM. It has 16K of RAM, if I recall off the top of my head. And in addition, regular Monochrome or MDA also has a very small amount of memory because the original IBM MDA standard does not support graphics modes. The thing is though, a lot of these types of cards contain 64K of DRAM specifically for the reason that the MDA emulation is actually Hercules emulation, and Hercules video standard does have 64K of video RAM because it supports fonts that can be changed, but it also has multiple pages of I think 720 by 350 resolution 1-bit graphics modes. And for that, it actually has 64K. So when you see a card like this with 64K of memory, that pretty much is telling you that it is emulating the Hercules video standard, but in CGA mode, all you're ever gonna get is the standard 4-color CGA graphics modes like any other standard CGA card. Now, when I went ahead and installed all these jumpers, unfortunately, I didn't really take any pictures of the board before I put the pin headers in, so I don't really remember what configuration the jumpers were in. And then I didn't really know what changing these jumpers was going to do, so I just kept swapping them around and changing different positions and trying out all the functions of the card until I discovered this card does some stuff that is actually really cool and I think pretty much undocumented, or at least not something that I knew about. So in this jumper configuration we have right here, this seems to be working in this mode that makes this card far better than I actually expected it to ever be. So what I want to do to show this card off a little bit is we're going to take this card and I'm going to switch this into CGA mode. So I'll put the switch in the lower position and we're going to plug this into my 46 test bench right here. And this cable right here goes to the RGB to HDMI. So that's just going to be helping me digitize the CGA video output. And let's power on the computer here and we should get a little bit of functionality. There we go. I'm just going to run check it here so we can take a look at some of the video modes that this thing supports. So we'll do video, all tests. There we go, 16K of RAM tested. So that's just the normal CGA amount of memory. So even though this has 64K, because we're in CGA mode, programs aren't going to ever see more than the 16K that the original CGA card had. So we have 4 pages of text mode video, and that's what that just tested. And then we have a bunch of different video modes here that it's going to do a little bit of flashing for. Sorry about the flashing. That's the RGB to HDMI switching modes. So everything here is pretty much run-of-the-mill. So there's the 16 colors we're going to get on CGA, digital TTL, where dark yellow is brown, which is that column over on the right side there. That is completely normal and as expected. And when we go to the graphics modes here, we have just the usual 320 by 200, and then we have 640 by 200, which is what we're looking at right here. Now, 640 by 200 is actually in monochrome, and that is just how the CGA standard is, but 320 by 240 does support these color palettes, which is cycling through right here, and these are the standard CGA color palettes that, unless you do programming of the 6845 directly, that's just how it's going to work. Those are the colors you get out of a CGA card. And when we hit enter here, we're just going to go through some more text modes and we're going to be back at the menu because, yep, it just went through all the CGA modes this card supports and it all looks perfect. Now let's run Jim Leonard's CGA Compatibility Test Suite. One thing I think is really great about this card is it actually is very, very compatible, at least from my recollection. So there are border colors that it fully supports and that works properly. With some 6845 programming, I think that's how it works. We're able to change the background color of these graphics modes. So this allows some color palettes that you might not normally see. And in addition, you can change the high-res foreground color. It's a little less useful. Normally it's just white and black, but it does allow you to pick different colors here. And in the 6845 compatibility section, this is where a lot of clone cards don't always work properly. The 6845 IC, I think it's made by Motorola, is a CRT controller. It's essentially what generates the sync signals and drives the refresh lines that go into the video memory and display your image. And the original CGA card and the MDA card used a real 6845. So a lot of these clone cards, when they have that small surface mount ASIC, they've taken all that functionality of the 6845 and they put it inside one of those custom chips. They don't always implement all the features or they may not implement them correctly. And Jim Leonard's utility here is really good at picking out where there are issues with the compatibility of that chip, which is why he wrote this program. The demos like 88 miles per hour really push the 6845 to the limit when it comes to trickery to enable extra graphics modes. And if you want to use a card that's fully compatible with that demo or the demo area 5150, going through this suite here and making sure that every single thing on here passes is a really good way to test test to make sure that the card is going to look good and work properly with those demos. I can tell you though that this particular card is very, very compatible, and we'll just quickly zoom through all these different things here. You can see the refresh rate is pretty much spot on. It's just off like ever so slightly, but it's pretty much perfect. This particular test here does some raster bars, and yes, this is totally possible on CGA, and this is happening because of some cool trickery with the 6845. If you have a 6845 that's not totally compatible, then this test might break as an example, but this is exactly how it's supposed to look, and as far as I'm aware, this looks perfect. This is the row reprogramming section here, and this allows these sort of pseudo high color video modes. Basically, it's using text mode, but it shrinks the characters down to, I think, 2 lines, and that gives you this pseudo graphics mode that allows 16 colors on a CGA card. And here's an example of something using that mode. And here's another example of something. Yeah, this is coming out of a stock CGA card. And I can tell you, hooked up to an actual CRT, this image looks absolutely fantastic. And this is some of the trickery that's done to facilitate those extra graphics modes that those demos use. And you have to have a card like this one that is fully compatible with the 6845 to make sure that this stuff works properly. You can also do larger text mode. So see, we're looking at 80 by 25, and we push a key there. Now we're looking at 90 by 30. Now on the RGB to HDMI, it's actually cropping off a little bit of the edges, but that's just because the way the settings are on there. But it just shows that this card can fully support this enhanced or larger video mode. It's essentially removing the borders. If you had it on a real CRT, you'd have text mode that went all the way off the edges of the screen. And then you have this mode here, which allows the picture to be moved around, and it has to do with the settings in the 6845, and that is working. That flashing we were seeing there, that's the RGB to HDMI, but that just allows you to position the image around. And the last one here is going to give some scrolling effect, and there it is. And this again has to do with the start address. I don't know if the way it's overlapping there is correct, but I think it is. Either way, this card is relatively compatible. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hook this composite video cable that goes into the RetroTink. I'm going to plug this into the color jack on the bottom here, and let's look at how the composite color looks. Now it looks like these things are a little bit jittery on the RetroTink 5X, but that is to be expected. It's not really designed to capture text like this. Let's see if we get some color out of this card here. So CGA card determination, really it's not working very well here. So the RetroTink at least isn't able to decode a color image off this card on this motherboard. Now the problem is here is that the color burst that comes out of a CGA card, even this one here, is derived from a clock that comes from the motherboard over the ISA slots. And this particular 46 motherboard, I think, just doesn't output exactly the right clock frequency. So even if I was using a real IBM CGA card, it wouldn't be working either. Now this might actually work fine with a color CRT, and it might just be a problem on the RetroTink, but I have a feeling it's actually not the problem, and I think it's just this motherboard that's not really working properly. I found what happens is that the manufacturers of these motherboards, they didn't really consider anyone using composite color, and the very earliest motherboards, like the XT motherboards, had a little adjustable capacitor on them to fine-tune that particular clock that went to the CGA card, so that if you didn't have a color image like we wouldn't now, you would just make an adjustment on that adjustable cap on the motherboard, and then the color would lock in. Thing is, this 46 doesn't have that, and like they didn't think anyone would ever use composite, so yeah, it's just not going to work. So this is not a fault of the card. This is absolutely a problem with this motherboard, and if I put this card into a different motherboard, it would probably work. Now if we switch this over to the other input here, which is the monochrome input, notice it has no more flashing anymore, and that's because there's no more color burst on this particular top jack, which is one of the things I really like about it. And if I switch this to S-Video green/blue, is it removed the filter that's on the composite input jack on here, which results in a much sharper image. Now, as far as that static we're seeing, again, this is a problem with the clock sampling on the RetroTink. Has nothing to do with the video output of this board. It looks rock solid when you have it hooked up to a monitor. But what I wanted to demonstrate is if I exit out of here, now the 80 column text looks a lot sharper there because it's not outputting any of those artifacts for the color. Like if I switch this back to the color jack, you will see there are now lines visible, and that is the color information that could possibly be sent out this color jack to be decoded by your monitor. But if we go back to the mono jack, notice those lines. Oh, it's a little bit dark, but there are no more lines or anything. Everything looks much better. And if we go up to color here, I can show that as well. So there we go. It's just nice shades of gray now. And if we switch back to the color jack, now you can see those lines there, which is completely appropriate and understandable. And yes, in case you weren't aware, CGA color composite video output does use NTSC artifact color exactly like the Apple II did. So that's why you're seeing those vertical lines, which look just like Apple II color. Now, incidentally, we're back on the RGB to HDMI. This is just a little cool thing about it, is that it actually has the ability to decode composite color through a CGA adapter. So if we go to composite low res, there we go. We're getting a black and white image over TTL RGB, but you can notice those lines, which is artifact color. And if we go into the menu here, you can see it says CGA NTSC artifact. And if we turn that on, we are actually going to get the color decoded. Now, the colors look wrong. So notice like 14 says rose and it's actually yellow. And unfortunately, that's one of the things about CGA color that actually causes problems on real CGA adapters. IBM CGA color output pretty much always has the same phase. So you're always going to get the expected colors when you're hooked up to the RCA jack. But third-party cards don't always work the same way when it comes to the phase of the video signal coming out. Now, what's cool about the RGB to HDMI is we're decoding the artifact color in the RGB to HDMI based on a TTL video signal, and it allows us to actually adjust the phase. So we can go through here until we get rose. So it looks like 180 degrees, I think is the correct phase. Oh, not quite actually. In fact, this looks to be the right phase, other than the fact that red, number 12 there, is actually showing up as orange. But that's probably just an artifact of the way the RGB to HDMI decodes the color, because the rest of these colors are actually all completely correct. And there's a couple other settings you can do. You can do sharp mode, soft mode, which adds a little bit of like color fringing around the text. Normal, I actually like to use the sharp mode. What's cool about this artifact decoding on the RGB to HDMI is that you can actually play old games that were designed with CGA artifact color in mind, and it allows you to see the way they were intended with additional colors that original CGA didn't support. Now, the problem is when you exit out and you go into 80 columns mode, the artifact color is still enabled, and that's why everything looks like this, because this would actually be what it would look like if you hooked up an NTSC color television and the color burst were enabled or output from the RCA jack. That's how the text would look. Very hard to read. Let me show you an example of a game running in artifact color mode. I'm going to pick number 2 there, Composite 160 by 200 at 16 colors. And we'll do PC speaker. And there it is. So this is how it would look, theoretically, if you were outputting this game on an actual composite color monitor, or NTSC one, through the RCA jack on your CGA card. What's cool about this game by David Murray as well is I think it allows you to change the phase. That's what this is doing, is that phase option, which we had inside the RGB to HDMI. This allows you to pick the correct one so that you can get the correct colors no matter what the manufacturer of your CGA card is using for the phase output of the composite video. Obviously, the correct color phase would be the road is that brownish color and the trees are green. And you can see this is looking, yep, pretty good. And this is all coming out of a stock CGA card. Now, if I hold down this button on the RGB to HDMI, there we go. It disabled the artifact color. And now we're just looking at what Planet X3 is generating through the TTL RGB. And this is what would be decoded into color with a composite monitor. Okay, so what I really was just trying to demonstrate there by all of that was I just wanted to show that this is a great CGA card. It works great, and unlike the real IBM CGA card, it doesn't have that flicker or any of the CGA snow, so it's actually a better and more improved CGA card over that, not to mention the fact that it's got these 2 jacks here with that nice smooth monochrome composite output. It just means that this thing is incredibly versatile when it comes to CGA. Now, back to this jumper stuff that I've installed. With the jumpers in this exact configuration, so I'm just going to zoom up here so you can actually see them. So JP6 is over on the right. This jumper right here is actually just not installed. That's JP3. JP5 is in the lower position, and then those 2 jumpers are in the upper position. That's JP2, 4, and 5. In this exact configuration right here, this card has some extra superpowers. So let's just pop this back in the machine here. I didn't change anything. This is exactly how it was already configured when I was just demonstrating how good of a CGA card it is. And I'm going to run through all the different video modes here on Planet X3. And this is exactly what I did for testing when I was experimenting with these different jump configurations. So I kept changing things on here and then running through all these modes. So I started with option 1 there, which is just CGA. I'm going to pick ad lib so we don't hear any music or anything. Yep, there it is, just a standard 4-color CGA color palette. And it allows swapping the palette around. That's in the game once you're in the game mode. So nothing to really talk about there. That's just as expected. I'll skip over 2. We already know the composite mode works because I was just demonstrating that. We can do the high res mode, which is just well, it's monochrome mode. It uses sort of shades of gray by dithering basically, and that obviously works, but that's nothing special. That would work on a standard CGA card. Now we have number 4 here, which is a Tandy mode, 160 by 200 in 16 colors. Now the Tandy graphics mode is actually 320 by 200 at 16 colors, but David just uses this lower res, which I think works on some machines that have less RAM or something like that. If we pick that mode though, it does this, which is completely standard. That's what's going to happen if you try to run a Tandy mode on a machine that, well, doesn't support Tandy. You're going to get that. So exit out. And now I'm going to do option 5, which is 320 by 200 at gray shades. And that's not working properly. So I think if you try that mode on a card that doesn't support this 4 shades of gray, you end up with this particular color palette. So you get white, black, the reddish color, and then the cyan color. I've tried this on other CGA cards, and I'm not sure I've ever had any card that actually supported this particular mode. So that's just an interesting curiosity. And no matter how the configuration of the jumpers were set on this thing, it just never supported that particular mode. And the next option is 6, and look at that. So this is the secret that I wanted to talk about. That whole lead up was to get to this, that with the jumpers in this configuration, this card is now fully Plantronics compatible, which means it has full 16 color graphics support, which essentially is the same thing as the Tandy mode, and it's a hidden feature. The way the jumpers were configured on this card out of the box did not have this mode enabled, because believe me, I tested all of these modes just to see what this card could do. And then I started fiddling around with all the jumpers on this card to try to see what I could discover. And I discovered that in this exact config now, it supports this Plantronics mode. Now the Plantronics mode is an extension of CGA, and if you don't have a card that's Plantronics compatible, what happens when you try to run it is you end up with the 4-color CGA palette. The way this mode works, from my understanding, is there are additional bit planes enabled to allow those extra bits of color to give you the 16-color palette. And for a card to support Plantronics video mode like this, it does need to have 64K of RAM, which obviously this card does have. But yeah, this card is fully Plantronics compatible with the jumpers set in this configuration, which is an awesome little bonus. Now, there are very few programs that support it. I think I have robots on here, which is Attack of the Petsky Robots. Does this support Plantronics? Oh, yes, it does. Number 7. Let's just see how this looks. I'll do no music, and look at that. That is really cool to see, full-on 16 colors coming out of this, I thought, just a normal CGA card. And it looks absolutely great. Look at this. Look how cool it is. This would be the same color palette as you would usually see in the Tandy graphics or PC Junior graphics, not to mention EGA card graphics as well. And thanks to David Murray for implementing these modes in his 2 games. I don't know how many other games are out there that support it, but there is at least C-Show, which is like a graphics image viewer, and I think there's a fractal viewer as well, or fractal, artwork viewer that supports Plantronics as well. But it's just pretty cool to know that that feature was dormant inside this card, and just changing around a few jumpers suddenly enabled it. Now that's not the only cool feature that I figured out about this card, so let me move on to the next one. I'm going to power off this machine here, and I'm going to switch the switch here into the MDA setting, and on the RGB to HDMI, I'm going to switch this thing over to Hercules, because that is basically what this card is emulating. And when we turn the computer back on, hopefully we'll have an image. Yes, we do. Now, remember, I didn't touch any of the jumpers. This is just exactly how it's configured on here. Well, as I showed a moment ago, switching between the CGA/Plantronics mode and MDA just requires flipping that switch. It's that easy. Now, all is good. This is a fully Hercules compatible card. The fact that the cursor looks like it's in the wrong position has to do with this Nancy driver that I'm running here, which is like a high-speed ANSI driver. If I take that out, it doesn't have a problem with the cursor. So that's not related to this card. That is just a thing with this particular video driver. So running Planet X3 here, if we pick Hercules, which I guess is 640 by 300, the resolution is actually by 350. So that's why it looks a little bit squished right now, and the horizontal resolution is actually 720, but because David's graphical assets for this game are not designed for 720 by 350, he just puts a border around it. But there we go. The card is working perfectly in Hercules mode, and yeah, it works flawlessly, actually. As I mentioned before, the Hercules mode is only one color, so it's just one bit, so it's black or white, and that's all you get out of it. Now, using this card here, if we run like the edit utility, everything just works as expected. You end up with essentially white, black, and a bright white. So, well, let's see if I can show that off here in the edit. So you see the letters there, new, open, and save, those look brighter, and that's just the intensity bit being set on the output from the TTL jack right here. And if we run the CGA compatibility suite, there we go. This card is actually really designed to be used on a CGA card, so it's not, I don't know, the reason why like the buttons are hard to read there and you can't really see the menus and stuff is just because Jim has designed this program to work on a color card and not on a black and white card like this. But essentially the BIOS knows that this is a monochrome card, and so does DOS. That means any programs that run are supposed to look that up and then honor the fact that it's a monochrome card and just use that intensity or bright white and dark white, and then the black background color. And then the main feature over CGA, and the reason why people liked MDA, is because you have a higher resolution text. But the way that IBM implemented MDA over CGA is that they got the higher resolution, those 350 lines, by slowing down the refresh rate. And the refresh rate of monochrome is actually 50 hertz versus 60 on CGA. And that allowed them to squeeze those extra lines of text in without really changing too much else about the way the monitor works. Standard NTSC video, or which is what CGA is, runs at like a 15.7 kilohertz horizontal scan rate, and to also increase the number of lines from the 200 all the way up to 350, they slowed it down to 50 hertz, and then they also increased that horizontal scan rate, I think, to around 18 point something kilohertz. It meant that that's still within the realm of most monitors, just with some minor changes that just allow them to display that extra resolution, but you did have that extra flicker, which is why the original IBM monochrome monitor had a long persistence phosphor to try to minimize the amount of flicker you get from 50 hertz. Anyhow, there's not really a whole lot to say, as I said, about this card. It is fully MDA compatible, but one day I was fiddling around and I noticed something kind of interesting about the way the card worked. And I noticed it specifically because of the RGB to HDMI's flexibility. Now, if I go into the menus on the RGB to HDMI and I go to the palette menu, currently it's set to MDA Hercules. And what this setting is doing is it's telling the RGB to HDMI to look at the specific pins that come out of the 9-pin jack here for the video signal and the intensity bit. And the palette setting here is essentially telling the RGB to HDMI to ignore the RGB signals that are coming out of the 9-pin. Because if you look at a pinout for MDA versus CGA, the video signal is on a different pin than the RGB signals that are on a CGA card. The intensity bit is the same between the two of them, but it's that extra video signal on MDA that does come out of a separate pin. That means if you take a CGA monitor and you plug it into a standard MDA card, well, not only is it going to not be able to synchronize to the video signal, you won't even see anything on screen because the CGA monitor is only looking at the RGB pins, and the original MDA card didn't have RGB pins on it. And of course, vice versa. Using an MDA monitor on a CGA card means you're not going to see any picture either. It's not going to synchronize, we won't see a picture, and that's because the MDA monitor is looking at a pin that doesn't exist on the card because CGA cards don't have anything wired up to that pin. Now this card here, because it obviously supports CGA and MDA, and there's a toggle switch, clearly it's wired up to the RGB pins and to the MDA pin and to the video output pin that's used for MDA on the 9-pin jack. Now if we go to the palette option here and we scroll through here, and we scroll over to RGBI, which is exactly the setting that's used for CGA. That is telling the RGB to HDMI to start looking at the RGB signals that are coming out of the video card. On a true MDA card, you're actually not going to get anything at all. You'll just have a black picture. But on this card, it seems to actually be outputting the video signal on the RGB signals, along with that extra pin that's used for the MDA monitor. So here in edit, you can see this, we're getting actually the same image that we were getting before, which is just a black and white image with the bright white there for the little marks, and see on the menu there, it all looks exactly the same. Now exiting out of here, look at this, color. So that's the other thing I want to talk about this card, is it actually supports color on monochrome. Now, if you do a little bit of reading online, you'll find that IBM's design for the original MDA card, the one that was released with the IBM 5150, the first IBM PC, it seems that they had actually intended to have color support on the monochrome video signal. There's some rudimentary work on the card there to enable that. And I can't remember if it's possible with some extra wiring to enable the color output, but it does seem that originally IBM had envisioned a higher resolution MDA text mode that did support color, but it just never got implemented, either for cost reasons or like whatever the reason. But for whatever reason, this card from VTEC implements the color MDA mode. So if we run Jim Leonard's CGA compatibility suite, there it is, we're in full color in MDA mode. And you can see with the high resolution text there that we are indeed in MDA mode, we're not in CGA mode. And we can go into the info menu and take a look at the source info there. And there it is, you can see we're running at 49 Hertz, so I guess it wasn't 50, it was actually 49. And you can see the capture size is 728 by 350. I think the couple extra pixels are just off the edge of the image. It's actually 720 wide. So indeed, the RGB to HDMI allows us to look at this color MDA signal. Now the thing is, I'm not sure of any monitors, any actual physical CRTs out there that would display this mode. Probably a multi-sync monitor, one of the old multi-sync monitors, the ones that can actually do 15 kilohertz and all the different RGB modes, might be able to do it, because generally those can sync up to all sorts of different sync ratios, and there's a physical switch on the monitor to pick between monochrome video input or RGB input. So I think switching to RGB input and then the sync signals coming in off the MDA card, it would probably work with this particular card. But if you want to see what color monochrome looks like, there it is right there. This VTEC card fully supports it. And I mean, as you can see here, it really, really does. And I think if we go to color here, oh, that's interesting. So for whatever reason, the way that Jim is doing this card here, it's not writing the color to the card. Well, that is. Oh, look at that. RGBI is, oh, okay, I think this is a setting on the RGB HDMI. Notice it doesn't have the brown color. I think if we go into here, into the color palette, there it is. There's a CGA option here, which gives us the brown. That is just a decoding thing in the RGB to HDMI. It has nothing to do with the actual signals coming out of the card. But yeah, you can see there that we have all the colors available to us, all 16 colors that you would have on CGA or any other TTL RGB type card. And I think none of the other things in Jim's program will work properly here, and that's because the card truly is running in MDA/Hercules mode right now. So none of the CGA graphics modes will work at all. So I can't like pick any of these modes here and have it actually function. The color one was sort of working because this is just strictly using a text mode. And I think Jim just writes to the video memory directly on the card and is writing color information into the video memory, which is why we're seeing color here. But when we exit the program and we run a program like Edit, we're seeing it in black and white specifically because this program checks the BIOS and goes, oh, we're in an MDA card, so it doesn't even try to display color. And I think most programs are going to work that way. But my hot directory program here doesn't seem to care about that. I think this was designed in like the 90s, and it doesn't even consider that someone has a monochrome card. So it just writes the color information directly to the frame buffer as well. And there you go. You can see we have full-on color. Now let's see what other programs actually display color. Like how about Landmark Speed Test? It's doing color there. Oh, okay, well that didn't work because I have to reboot with Shift held down. Obviously the BIOS is not going to do it because, yep, that's just going to display it in monochrome because it knows we have an MDA card, and so it doesn't even try. Like if I do Shift F2, it's just going to go through like the two monochrome palettes that are in here. My assumption is if you took IBM MDA card and you modified it for color output, that it would work exactly the same way as this, that most programs would just only run in monochrome because they honor what the BIOS says, and then other things that just write directly to the video memory and ignore what the BIOS says, like what's happening there, and like what's happening right here, would actually show color on the actual IBM card as well. Let's run N format. No, N format does honor the monochrome mode properly, so that doesn't do anything. How about IMD? Oh, IMD, kind of interesting. So the help mode has green text, but the rest of the program is running in monochrome mode. So that's sort of like a pseudo color mode. Normally this, if you display it on a color video adapter, you'll have a blue background with red at the top and stuff like that. I'm going to run Jim Leonard's top bench. My assumption is he's going to have used the same code to display the text mode that he used in CGA compatibility. So it's going to be color as well. And yep, it certainly is. And oops. And this doesn't have any kind of graphics mode. So yeah, there we go. We're totally running in color text mode on an MDA card. I mean, it's kind of a useless thing what's happening here. Like there's no real use for this. But I think it's just really curious that this card fully implements this color MDA mode. And I don't know if it's by accident or on purpose or what the deal is, but it does implement it properly and seems to work perfectly. Now, if we go into the palette mode here in the RGB HDMI and we switch this back to Hercules mode, now it's going to be pulling the video signal off that other pin, and this card does correctly output that video signal. So here we are on top bench, and this is exactly how it would look on a real IBM MDA card hooked up to a real IBM Monochrome monitor. So there we have it. That is the VTEC CGA/MDA card that does a lot more than you would first imagine. If you happen to have one of these, I highly recommend that you break it out and you play around with it a little bit, make those jumper changes that I showed on here. I don't remember which jumper actually enables the Hercules, so you could try all the jumpers except for the one that you have to make this cut on the board for first, and then you can see if you have the Hercules, or not Hercules, the Plantronics mode enabled. And if not, then you might have to install that jumper. If I recall, it was one of the jumpers up at the top here that enabled the Plantronics mode. So I don't think you have to even touch these ones down here. Just leave them the way they are and install the jumpers up here and have it in this configuration. I already really liked this card before I did these mods to it, and now I love it even more because it's just really cool to have a card that has all these cool modes available to me to use, especially the Plantronics mode, because I actually don't have any other cards that I'm aware of that support the Plantronics 16 color mode, except for these VTEC cards. And these cards, as I mentioned, were found in many of VTEC's clone computers, the early ones. So they seem to be not hard to find. I don't know like what the prices are these days if you look on eBay, and I don't know how common these are to be found at all. But as I mentioned, I've ended up with a few of these just over the years, and I just used this one because I thought it was cool, and then I didn't realize how much cooler it actually was. So I hope you enjoyed this video, this little exploration of this cool video card. If you did, thumbs up, all the usual stuff. Huge thanks to my patrons. Their names are scrolling up the side of the screen over here. They make it possible I do this full time. If you want to become a patron, there's a link in the description below. What I was gonna say, yeah, you know, subscribe, all the usual YouTube junk, and I think that's gonna be that. So stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.